Hi, friends. My name is Host Eric. I'm the host of Talking with Famous People, and I am not only a typologist, but also a former debate coach with many years of experience. And I thought I'd go do a depoliticized lecture on communism versus capitalism. The reason I'm motivated to do so is I saw an hour plus long lecture from Prager University on the subject. That's the conservative college that affiliates with Jordan Peterson. Anyway, I thought I can do this quick, easy, non political. It's straightforward, okay? And it's worth doing because people have all kinds of crazy notions about it, surprisingly. Here's the gist. Step one. This is in 10 steps. Step one. Ownership has three aspects: status, control, and capacity to retain. So I might control something right now that I borrowed from you. You have the status. I don't have the capacity to retain, but I do have the control. It's yours. Mostly individuals own things. This means they control them and retain them mostly. But it can also mean that they can accuse someone of theft if you take their stuff. Groups can also own things, but almost always designate individuals or committees to exercise the control parts, decision making. If it's a small enough group, there may be a straight up Athenian democracy vote on the matter. Individuals, but usually that's not the case with any group of any size. Individuals so designated act in accordance with their own understanding of how best to exercise the power afforded them. So remember, when we do designate somebody as the representative voice of our group, having the decision-making power of our group, and I'm talking about non-governmental groups here, like a business, for example. I designate you as the HR person. Well, then they're going to be empowered to hire and fire, and they're going to do so according to their own discretion. Okay. Number 4. We're already on step 4. Capitalism is the absence of control mechanisms on engagements among groups, non-governmental, and individuals, groups and groups, groups and individuals, individuals and individuals, that sometimes manifests in prosperity and autonomy, that absence of control mechanisms, and sometimes manifests in exploitation and contractual slavery. So that's the reality of it. Completely unchecked individuals and groups operating under a purely capitalistic frame, which is to say, there's nothing controlling me and I want to benefit me as much as possible, will sometimes manifest as exploitative stuff, right? Bad behavior that we can fairly criticize corporations or individuals or groups for engaging in, but not fairly point to capitalism as the source of it. Because capitalism does not necessarily manifest like that. Only bad individuals do bad capitalism. The government is a unique kind of group. Step 5, we're already on step 5. It is responsible for representing wealth in a fungible form, namely currency. It's responsible for producing currency, is one of its jobs, that no other group has. It has a monopoly on use of force. That's unique to government as well. That means it's the only one who can legitimately or legally shoot people and do stuff like that, or make them go to jail or whatever. And as such, it's the only group that can meaningfully constrain all other individuals and groups. C. It has accountability mechanisms which can either, 1, reinforce the control of specific individuals within the group. Think North Korea. It has plenty of accountability mechanisms in North Korea too, but they're just all in the service of Kim Jong-un or whomever. Or it can reinforce the authority of the group over those individuals by empowering limiting committees, like courts, for example, that are in charge of constraining the jurisdiction of government, by changing the individuals designated to represent people, namely elections, by designating some control to subgroups, by isolating bits of control to committees, and by separating those, by separating those committees. In other words, like justify your budget. So by having them compete against each other, you could say, for capacity to control in the name of the group. That's if a government is using its accountability mechanisms in what we would consider a democratic fashion or in a representative fashion. And I'm not making any statements about democracy here, you'll note, right? The proper comparison is really between communism and democracy. Capitalism is not ideology, it's the absence of control mechanisms. And it's important to remember that. Okay, so now we're on to step 6. Communism proposes group ownership as the answer to capacity to retain. If you recall, there are 3 aspects to ownership: control, status, and capacity to retain. Communism observes the rich stay richer, the poor stay poor or get poorer. The group would use all that wealth more fairly. Step 7. But while it's true that rich people are rich in part because of their capacity to retain wealth, A, actuality of retaining wealth follows from the actuality of effectively controlling it. B, retention does not represent inequality of distribution in some way, because C, new wealth manifests whether useful work is done whenever useful work is done, but D, currency has to be created and currency isn't distributed. So in other words, the amount of wealth in the world is constantly changing, but the increased amount of currency being pushed out by various governments is only sort of commiserate with that. 8. It's not true that poor people are poor because of their capacity to retain. So in other words, communists may say the rich stay rich and the poor stay poor. But they're talking about totally different things. The rich stay rich because they're good at retaining wealth. The poor are not poor because of their capacity to retain. They aren't good at retaining poverty. They may be bad at retaining wealth. They may be less likely to retain wealth because of their circumstances, or they may be personally good at retaining wealth and then become rich. Thus, communism, and we get down to step 9, disincentivizes. Thus, communism, as we get down to step 9, makes the following errors. Number A, it mistakes status for control. The group may own something, but can't meaningfully control it. B, it mistakes currency for wealth. Currency stickiness is only seen as hoarding of wealth when the link between utility and wealth is very weak. So, in other words, one way in which capitalism needs to sometimes be constrained, or we all seem to benefit when it is when we don't have situations where a large number of people are doing a very low skill level of work for a small amount of money, as part of some individual's plan to get himself rich. So that tends to not play very well, right? But that's just one manifestation of consensuality in the engagements between people. So communism makes the following errors. It mistakes status for control. It mistakes currency for wealth. It mistakes government for a regular group. Governments aren't proposed. Why did I put proposed? Supposed. Supposed to. Or, I don't know. Purposed. Oh, purposed. Governments aren't purposed to retain wealth, although some do. Government is most empowered when individuals and non-governmental groups can predictably control and preserve wealth. Because when individuals and non-governmental groups can predictably control and preserve wealth, that generates more tax revenue for government, and therefore government is presumably more empowered by having more wealth. Of course, the reality of it is the linkage between actual wealth in a given country and the amount of money they're spending on things there's this additional time frame issue. So there's this issue of debt and surplus, right? That makes it more complicated than this. But this is the short lecture, right? Don't waste your time at Prager University. I'll give you everything you need to know right now without any of the bullshit. So government is most legitimate when it respects the status aspect of ownership, which affords control and retention to the status owner. So what communism ideologically does is it mistakes harming the healthy for curing the sick. If we remove from wealthy people the capacity to retain wealth, that somehow that's going to improve the amount of wealth poor people have or their capacity to retain wealth. But there's no linkage there at all. And by invalidating legitimate wealth retention, in other words, in the initial seizure of everybody's private property, it disincentivizes all the benefits of autonomy. Namely, there are some people in the world, I may not be one of them, who want to put a total handle on shit and get as many overtime hours as possible because they're saving up for something, right? Well, there's those people are creating a lot of wealth in the world, manifesting it, although it's not turning it into currency in their pockets, right? And those people should be able to do that. But if in fact there's no payoff at the end, if in fact they aren't going to be rewarded in kind with value that they can understand as such, then we have no reason really for them to work hard or try hard or anything like that, right? So now let's look at the last one, number 10. Manifestation of wealth precedes the representation of that wealth in the economy. And this is basically what I've been explaining. Because value is both objective and subjective, what it's worth versus what someone will pay is what we mean by objective and subjective. So the actual value of a given thing is somewhat determined by what it is, and somewhat determined by how urgently you need it right now, and somewhat determined by how hard it is to get, and somewhat determined by what you're actually going to use it for. No means exists to match new currency to new wealth because the value is determined by the willingness to pay and the amount paid, and the exchange of existing wealth, it is that exchange that proves that what's been done, the work that's been done, has actual monetary value. In other words, if you're not willing to give up some of your finite and not replenishing supply of currency to me, then you don't really want it bad enough. And then B, inequity in control and retention do link to how currency enters the economy. And I will say this at the end, that in America at least, it would seem that we have a very poor system of introducing currency into the economy. Every year, the federal government has to infuse the economy with additional amounts of dollars. So, while the total amount of currency in circulation at one point in America's history was, say, $1 billion, now it's $1 trillion. I don't know what the numbers are, but the point is, every year, it's called quantitative easing. But the reason it exists is because of this phenomenon that I've correctly described, that apparently economists don't seem to understand, but regardless, that wealth manifests first before currency represents it. It's one of the only things in human existence that works like that, where it manifests first as a metaphysical quality of beholdens, and then only after becomes something concrete and fungible. And the thing that it becomes is entirely fungible. So that it's very rare in that quality. Regardless, the way the United States infuses the additional currency needed because it was created by the work of people during the previous year to create new wealth is they give it to banks, which then loan it to people. It would seem to me, I've yet to have anybody explain to me why they don't just do this. Whatever total amount of new currency they're going to infuse into the economy, just split it among all the individuals evenly and send them all that much currency. Why not do that? I don't know. It would have to be on a yearly basis. In other words, what I'm saying here is true. You can't match like that for the reasons I articulate. But nevertheless, that would be a way better way of matching than the way that we're currently doing it in the United States. Just a little thought at the end. Again, I hope this has been entirely a unpoliticized thing. It's important to remember that communism is an ideology, not really a government. To the extent that it manifests as a government, it's simply a oligarchical, totalitarian, zero-sum approach to wealth, which is we're going to retain it, and we're going to retain the right to retain all wealth, thereby making it meaningless for other people to attempt to generate wealth, thereby vastly reducing the amount of total wealth made manifest in this country, and thereby meaning you're under constant currency problems, because if you add more currency, you get inflation because it doesn't mean anything, because it's not linked to anything meaningfully. If you don't add any more currency, then the whole thing just stagnates, but you don't really get deflation either because there's not any meaningful real economy going on. All of these kind of things, right? Regardless, that doesn't mean that some policies that some people might view as socialist or communitarian in some regard, like every year the Federal Reserve hand out the total amount of currency they're going to infuse into the economy, split into chunks for the total number of individuals, and give every individual that equal chunk of currency, seems vastly preferable to the way we're currently doing it, and yet some people would accuse it of being socialistic in some regard. I'm no communist, as you can see. I understand communism for what it is, an ideology that is built on a failure to understand what ownership is, or wealth, or work, or anything. But I'm not politically against the idea that when we serve communitarian ends, that when we, as a group, decide to empower disadvantaged people, either by making laws about when you build a new business, you've got to put a ramp so handicapped people can get in there. I'm not fundamentally opposed to that sort of communitarian spirit. It's important to recognize, therefore, that democracy can successfully implement the kind of communitarian spirit that we're looking for as decent human beings in general, so long as it's very vigorous in the accountability mechanisms that I articulated earlier. There have to be some sort of limiting principles, and we can't simply abandon any of the individual's claim to ownership of themselves and their bodies and what they do and how they say things. And, we can't forsake that while retaining a larger integrity, because the larger integrity is built on those individual autonomies being empowered. So that's all you need to ever know about capitalism and communism, really. It's everything in a nutshell, and anybody trying to make it more complicated than this is wrong.